Welcome to this Fathom interview. I'm Jack Jack. I'm Deputy Editor of Fathom. Alongside me is our editor, Alan Johnson, and we're delighted to be joined today by Jonathan Spire. Jonathan is a journalist and Middle East analyst. He's Director of Research at the Middle East Forum and the author of The Transforming Fire, The Rise of the Israel-Islamist Conflict. He's a veteran of the Israel-Hezbollah War of 2006 and has been a regular contributor to Fathom for a decade. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Jack. Thanks for inviting me.
So we're talking Iran today. We've provisionally titled this interview Learning from Frogs after you reading your recent article in the Jewish Chronicle. Can we start there with the proverbial frog in boiling water? You say they've been casually slandered and we should actually be learning from them. How so?
Yes, well, it appears so. This was new for me, a recent discovery for me. We're probably all familiar with the common trope in which people who are failing to notice a long process being carried out to their detriment are compared to a frog placed in a pan of cold water, and then the water being slowly heated until the frog, not noticing what's going on, is eventually cooked alive. And what I discovered recently was that this is in fact not true in the case of frogs. In fact, a frog, when placed in cold water, will jump out at a certain point if it gets too hot, or if it's placed into boiling water, will instantly die. So therefore, it's not a very good comparison. Having said that, what I was trying to say in the article was that whilst that apparently is not true of frogs, it is nevertheless apparently true of human affairs. That's to say, we can find very good examples of situations in which countries or cultures or polities are placed in a situation of of a threat that manifests itself slowly and over time, and chips away at and steadily erodes the position of a particular country or people. And because of the slow-moving nature of the threat, the subject of it does not necessarily notice what's going on until very late in the day, or perhaps not at all. I think that's something we can observe in all kinds of areas of human affairs, and in my estimation, at least, obviously, which is the reason why we got into all this whole comparison. That's how I would see our situation. I think that we, and when I say we, I mean Israel, of course, but I do also mean the broader Western world, are subject to a slow-moving, slowly advancing threat of that kind. And it seems to me that we have not properly noticed the dimensions of it or the implications of it, and therefore have not properly begun to organize against it in a way that can bring success.
So, Jonathan, if I asked a few questions about that slowly building threat, three I have, I think. One would be, I guess, how hot's the water? By which I mean, has the Iranian strategy been successful? How far along has it got? The second kind of question would be, where do we fit the recent exchange between Israel and Iran into that notion of a slowly building threat, and the two countries' understanding of their relationship and the conflict between them? And I guess thirdly, Joe Biden's comment after Israel's drone and missile attack was, you had to win, take the win. What was he messaging there, and why, and should Israel listen? So three kinds of questions. The first one is, how hot's the water?
Yeah, and so how far along are we in this? Look, I mean, if we look at the Arabic-speaking Middle East today, the fact is that Islamic Republic of Iran today effectively administers a massive chunk of it. That's to say, Iran has either effectual control or ascendancy in 4 Arab countries, 3 of which have direct borders with one another. Those 3 being Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq. And of course, these are the countries which are located between Iran and Israel, not by chance, and also between Iran and the Mediterranean Sea. And Iran has set out very deliberately over the last, I would say, quarter century now, over the last roughly 25 years, to secure that dominance in those 3 countries. And they've more or less done that. It's more or less a done deal. Let's say in Lebanon today, it's clear that the Lebanese Hezbollah organization, which is, of course, the prototypical Iranian IRGC proxy organization, is today the de facto ruling authority in Lebanon. In Syria, the Assad regime is a largely hollowed out shell, and the Iranian interests taking the form of usually non-Syrian, by the way, militia groups on the ground in Syria, usually Lebanese or Iraqi, or sometimes also Afghan or further afield, even Pakistani militias on the ground in Syria, have complete freedom of action in Syria. The Assad regime cannot tell them what to do, or insofar as their freedom of action is limited, it's limited by the presence of the United States and its Kurdish ally in northeast Syria, but not by the presence of the Assad regime. And in Iraq, the government of Prime Minister Mohammad Shia Sudani is in essence a government of the militias, no less a authority than Qais al-Ghazali, excuse me, a leader of the Saybah al-Haq, one of the most important pro-Iran militias, described Prime Minister Mohammad Shia Sudani as a general manager rather than a prime minister, which is a rather apt way of putting it, essentially saying that Sudani is an appointee, in essence, of the militias rather than a chief executive or a prime minister. So it's well developed because those three countries are essentially under the control of Iran. Yemen, we know also, is at least to a great part, including the capital city Sana'a, controlled by the Iranian proxy, the Ansar Allah or Houthis movement. And as we've seen since November of last year, that possession is not anecdotal. It's not just that Iran is controlling, some stretch of sand somewhere down in the Gulf. It enables and has enabled the Iranians and their proxy to effectively close down a large percentage of global shipping in a key maritime trade route, namely the Gulf of Aden and Red Sea route up to the Suez Canal. So it's pretty well advanced in the sense that Iran controls the entire land area between Iran and Israel, and also happens to be between Iran and the Mediterranean Sea, and can also close down or severely disrupt shipping on a key global maritime trade route. And lastly, of course, Iran has issued a hostile takeover bid, if one could put it that way, for the Palestinian cause. And that takeover bid is now largely complete. Hamas, according to all available polls, are the most popular Palestinian movement. Hamas is a client, not a proxy, but a client of Iran. And the October 7th massacre, an act of terror, is quite unimaginable without the assistance or capacities afforded to Hamas by Islamic Republic of Iran. That doesn't mean, of course, that Iran was sort of managing things on the day. I'm not saying that they weren't either. We don't know about that. It's quite possible they were not. But it does mean that the military capacities that were on display, up to and including, by the way, the ability to use drones to take out cameras along the border fence, for example, were quite beyond Hamas's capabilities a decade or a decade and a half ago. And they've acquired those capabilities from the relationship with Iran. So in terms of how hot's the water, the answer is that Iran, in my estimation at least, is currently the key strategic player in the Middle East. It is current, and its methods of proxy warfare have proven remarkably applicable to the Middle East context as we've witnessed it over the last decade or decade and a half. So I say that what I mean by that is since the sort of Middle East order collapsed in 2010, 2011 with the coming of the so-called Arab Spring, the main beneficiary of that collapse of the Arab order has been Islamic Republic of Iran. So I think we're quite a long way advanced along that road. And I want to just add to say that, which I'll go on to answer the rest of the questions, but just to say that one of the reasons for that precisely is because we've been asleep at the wheel. As the water has got so hot, precisely we haven't been noticing and haven't been trying to do anything about it all the way along the line, which takes me, I guess, to the second question regarding the recent exchange of fire, so to speak, between Israel and Iran. First of all, I think it's important to note that the Iranian attack was not in April was not an all-out attack intended to bring war. In other words, it was not a Pearl Harbor moment or a, was it June 22nd, 1941, a sort of, the Germans sweep into the Soviet Union. And it wasn't that. If it had been that, then the Iranians would have mobilized the proxies as well. And most specifically, they would have mobilized Lebanese Hezbollah, which is by far the greatest threat against Israel that they have. But they didn't. What they did was they launched a very, very large amount, of course, as we know, of ballistic missiles and drones. They telegraphed that they were going to do that a long way, many hours in advance, thus enabling Israel and the coalition around it to effectively mobilize to defend it. Why did they do that rather strange combination? To me, it seems fairly clear The reason is because what the Iranians wanted to do was to get back to the strategy of slow strangulation of Israel. They don't want to get into a frontal war against Israel right now. But what they wanted to say to Israel was, if you think you're going to get into the kind of strategy of killing people like Major General Mohammad Reza Zahedi, whose killing, of course, triggered this, was if you're going to start now challenging Iranians as well, up to high-ranking Iranians, then, you know, we're going to respond in a very frightening way. So you shouldn't do that. You should just let things get back to normal so we can carry on trying to slowly strangle you. That's what I think the dimensions of that attack was. Had they actually wanted open war, it wouldn't have looked like that. And frankly, we wouldn't have been quite as lucky as we were. You know, if they were to launch hundreds of thousands of rockets rather than 30,000, some of that would have got through. So I think what the Iranians were actually trying to do was a sort of warning, which is why Israel's response was in a certain way commensurate. So when Israel said, okay, well, you're going to warn us, we're going to use our network inside Iran to warn you as well. We're going to show you that actually, should we wish to do so, we have the capacity to get into the part of Iran where, you know, key sites, including those related to the nuclear program, are located. And if we wanted to hit them, we could do. To me, the key question now is, will Israel go on hitting senior Iranian targets in Syria, Iraq, and elsewhere? If Israel does not, then we can conclude that the Iranians achieved their goal, which was to say to Israel, look how high a price we can put on this, so don't do it. If Israel does carry on now hitting, you know, if in a month's time we hear of a similar figure to Zahedi being killed in Damascus or wherever else, then I think Israel will have responded in the correct way, which was not to go crazy, not to say, okay, well, you didn't want a full-out war, but we do now, but to say, no, we've decided to act when we want to act. We've decided to raise the temperature of this. We understand what you're trying to do. And you, Iran, should understand that you're going to be part of the circle of targets. It's not going to be just your Arab proxies who you couldn't care less about who suffer in this. It'll be you suffering as well. So I think we still have to see whether that response was commensurate or not. And we will know within, I would say, 3 to 6 months, whether the Iranians have brought about a change in Israeli behavior as a result of the attack or whether they have not. That's where I think things stand. And therefore, with regard to the third question about Biden and take the win, yeah, well, this, I think, brings us to a whole new and different dimension of the conversation, which I think is deeply important, namely the issue of Western strategy with regard to Iran and the Iranian threat. My view, at least, is that the West and the United States administration, by its behavior, appears to be utterly unaware of the nature of the game, utterly unaware of the nature and dimensions and seriousness of the Iranian threat to the Middle East order. And I would, and the reason why I draw that conclusion is because if we look at the behavior of the US administration with regard to Iran since Biden took office, there's been it's not possible to discern anything else. I think it's not possible to discern any clear pattern, because if we think of $16 billion, 6 billion from South Korea and 10 billion from Iraq, coming on back to being available for Iran as a result of United States decision making. If we think of the hosting of Prime Minister Mohammad Shia Sudani of Iraq, the very same, just a couple of weeks ago in the United States, at the same time, in the very same week that the Iraqi Shia militias are launching 5 rockets at the Rumelan landing base maintained by the United States Armed Forces in northeast Syria, then it's just clear that there isn't any strategic thinking behind that. Sometimes the Americans are hard on the Iranians, sometimes they're not. And I have to say that if I look at the developing situation with regard to the war in Gaza now, this deeply worries me, because I think as a result of the lack of Western, I want to say not just American, I mean the Americans are by far the lead, are not at all the worst on this. It's just they're the most consequential, so we have to think more about them. If we look at the Western response, or response of Western governments, to Israel's actions in Gaza over the last half year now, or 7 months now, I think it's clear that Israel is simply not going to be permitted to win a war. That's the meaning of this. The current political and diplomatic realities of where we are at are that as a result of Western pressure, among other things, but to a great extent Western pressure, Israel will be prevented from carrying a military campaign through to a successful conclusion. And that, I think, has profoundly significant and profoundly worrying implications. Because, of course, if Hamas comes out of the events of the last 7 months intact as a de facto governing authority in Gaza, if Hamas is able to rebuild, to sort of come out from the rubble, and, you know, maybe Sinwar will still be down in a bunker somewhere like Nasrallah has been since 2006, but the Islamist authorities supported by Iran will have been seen to have committed the atrocity of October 7th and then come through it and survived it, then that, you know, projects enormous weakness on the part of the West and on the part of Israel also. And that, I think, may well be where we're heading towards. I sincerely hope we aren't, but I think we may well be. If we are, that also, in my view at least, is a product of the absence of strategic thinking on the part of the United States vis-a-vis the Iranian threat, of which the take the win statement was a recent example. I'll give you one other example from my own work. A few weeks ago, 3 weeks ago now, I was in southeastern Syria in the Deir ez-Zor area. It's not a highly reported on area because it's quite inaccessible, but it's very important strategic real estate, because that's an area where a Western-supported force with the Kurdish dominated SDF and United States forces are battling with an Iranian attempt to expel the Americans and then destroy the Kurdish de facto authority. And the reason they want to do that is because that area of land that the Americans and Kurds control down in Deir ez-Zor sort of cuts into the land corridor that the Iranians want to maintain between the Iraq-Iran border and the borders with Israel or the Mediterranean Sea. And there is an ongoing insurgency down there in which on a daily basis, there are attacks across the Euphrates by Iranian-supported forces. There are rockets and drones launched regularly at SDF and American targets. And there is very fascinatingly a clandestine campaign going on as well, where the Iranians are trying to buy off tribes on the eastern side of the river to cause them to revolt against the Kurdish and American authority. Now, it's a fascinating thing to look at closely. And it also shows us, I think, a lot about what you asked about. Because on the one hand, you have this Iranian strategy of insurgency in which a variety of forces are involved. Lebanese Hezbollah is there, the IRGC is there, the Syrian regime is there, and client tribal forces are there. There's a clear objective, there's a clear strategy, there's a clear division of functions, everybody works together. And on the other side, you have the Americans and the Kurds. But the Americans have no actual formal relationship with the Kurdish SDF. The only formal relationship they have is they're both there to fight ISIS as part of Operation Inherent Resolve. But that ended 6 years ago, effectively, or 5 years ago, effectively. So the Americans could leave any day. The Kurds, the allies of the Americans in that context, know that, and that influences their behavior as well. It also influences the behavior of the people on the ground in that area, because they're much more reluctant to work with America's allies when they think that America might leave tomorrow, and then they'll have to pay the price for that with whoever comes in next, which will be the Assad regime and the Iranians. So it's another example, and there are many others, where the absence of strategy ends up having very clear and practical and detrimental results. And yes, I do think that there is a clear absence of Western strategy vis-a-vis the Iranian project, and I do think that it's having, you know, detrimental results on a clear basis in a number of places across the region.
Thanks,
Thank you,
John.
Jonathan. Sorry. Thank you, Jonathan. A number of questions in response to that. One of the key elements of the war in Gaza is the reestablishing of an Israeli deterrence that was badly damaged on October 7th. I mean, you hinted at the question of deterrence in your answers there. I mean, there are those who would suggest that crippling 18 or 20, depending on how you measure it, of Hamas's Gazan battalions might itself constitute deterrence re-established, and therefore that the full completion of the job that going into Rafah indicate is perhaps not necessary. Can you explain why you would differ from that, if you do, and to what extent the Israeli operation in response to Iran's attack? You mentioned that was an indication to Iran that Israel could strike not only Iran's proxies but Iran directly. To what extent that operation was a successful re-establishment of an Israeli deterrent?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so with regard to the first issue, yeah, to me, the point here is political, which is the following. The authority, the political entity which carried out the attack on Israel on October 7th should by its having done so forfeited its right to exist. On a moral level, of course, I think that's, don't need to get it to even discuss that, it's clear. But I mean, not on a moral level, I mean on a practical and strategic level as well. The point is that the strategy according to which Israel sort of trusted, in its ability to either deter or defend against a de facto jihadi or Islamist entity on its borders should have been gone forever from October the 7th. It's clear that it's a level of risk we cannot afford to allow the growth of Islamist armies on two borders. We've got two of them, of course. Hamas is one. The more consequential one is Lebanese Hezbollah on the northern border. We've been following a kind of de facto strategy, and again, kind of in a way, unfortunately, typical of a lot of the way things get done in Israel. It wasn't a strategy that was ever properly discussed and formulated. It just sort of kind of emerged by osmosis, so to speak, and then it kind of became written in stone, and it was what we did. And what we did was we said, well, we don't really care what's on the other side of the fence, as long as the fence is good. We don't have to take a great interest in Arab politics or Islamism or have any of those discussions. That's all nonsense. Other people can waste their time on that. We're practical people. What we need to have is well-made fences, mainly reliant on our kind of unassailable superiority in terms of technology. That was a clearly wrong strategy, and that produced, among other things, I mean, October 7th was the product of a number of different errors, but that was a pretty major one, I think. And I think we would be well advised to have dispensed with that. So purely from a security point of view, I don't think we can afford to have an Islamist entity still growing up next to our borders. But also from the point of view of deterrence, yeah, no, I don't think so. I think if the Islamist entity survives the attack, it will have won a glorious and strategic victory. Let me be absolutely straight about this, and that's the way it will present it. But I think it will be right. Sinwar, if he survives this, or the Hamas leadership they survive, will say, okay, here's what we did. We carried out our, what do they call it, act of resistance or whatever on October 7th. The Zionists threw absolutely everything they had at us, and by a smart strategy, reflecting a very deep understanding of our enemy, we've come through it straight. We've come through it intact. What do I mean by understanding of the enemy? I said right at the beginning of this war in a briefing that I gave for The Spectator, for Spectator TV, together with Professor Andrew Roberts, the following, that there were three timetables running in this war, and they weren't running in sync for one another from an Israeli point of view. And they were the timetables of the military campaign, the diplomatic arena, and the issue of the hostages. And that what Hamas would be trying to do would be trying to use the hostage issue and the diplomatic issue against is to slow down Israel's military campaign until such a point that its completion no longer became feasible, at which point the Hamas Authority would survive. That's basically how I described what I thought their strategy was going to be at the beginning of this. I think that is the strategy they have pursued. And I think if the Hamas Authority in Gaza comes out of this intact, it will be able to say that was what we tried to do. That's what we did because we read the situation right. And consequently, we've come through it alive. We've come through it intact. And now we can start building again. You know that Sinwar said somewhere, it doesn't matter if it's 10,000, even 100,000 of our people die. That's okay, as long as we're on the right road. That, I think, is the Islamist outlook. I think we can, all three of us, I think, are familiar with all kinds of examples of that. So the notion that, you know, a victory in which a large number of soldiers were killed, which is what this will look like to Hamas if it comes through this intact, will be a form of deterrence, or be sufficient to build deterrence, is, in my view at least, to completely misunderstand, once again, the nature of the enemy. I also, let me be clear, think that, or I also had hoped and still hope that we can use October 7th, not only in order to complete business in the southwest, by which I mean to destroy the Islamist entity down there, but also to use it to deal a very telling blow to the much more consequential Islamist army to the north, that of Lebanese Hezbollah. I think I'm on record as being in favor of preemptive Israeli action in the north. And I think that absolutely should be part of this. And my view is that October 7th should be used by us as the trigger to radically reshape our strategy of the last 20 years, to say, no, we get the point. Iran has slowly built up two Islamist armies on our borders with the intention of using them to slowly make our country unfeasible and unviable and eventually destroy it. We are now going to act proactively against that, to destroy both of those Islamist armies. That's where I think we should be going. I fear right now that we're probably not going in that direction, but in any case, that remains my view of what should be done. And the second question you asked was about deterrence with regard to Israel's recent counter action. As I said, I think that the Iranian action against Israel was to do with Israel's region-wide actions against Iran, specifically the killing of General Zahedi. So I think one has to consider that first trigger when considering that whole sort of episode. If by asking, did that reestablish deterrence, you're asking, if we kill someone like Zahedi again, as a result of what we did in response to Iran's response to that, will they think twice about responding in that way again? The answer is no, I don't think they will, because I think what they noticed from that response was that whilst it was coherent in its own way, it obviously did, and we all know this, even as people, I guess, without sort of classified knowledge of the operation, it clearly did demonstrate a very, very considerable Israeli capacity on Iranian soil, and that's very impressive. But it also was demonstrated at basically no cost to the Iranians themselves, and I assume that the Iranians will also have taken note of that. That it certainly demonstrated Israeli capacities, but it clearly did so in a way intended to do very, very minimal harm to the Iranians. So I'm personally very much doubt whether, as a result of that response, we can now, let's say, kill someone similar to Zahedi again and be secure that the Iranians won't respond in the way they did because of the extent or nature of our response to their attack. No, I don't think that will be found to be the case.
Thank you, Jonathan. A couple of further questions from me, if that's okay. I mean,
sure.
To what do you ascribe Western complacency on Iran? Is it a fundamental misreading of Iranian intent? Is it an overestimation of Western existing mechanisms or relative strength? Is it just sort of Panglossian optimism? What is it? And do you think that the Iranian involvement in the war in Ukraine and maybe even the attack of April 13th, have they woken anyone up?
I think there is, as a result, also, as you aptly mentioned, a result of the sort of emergent alliance between Iran and Russia, as reflected in Iranian provision of drones to the Russians and the Ukrainian front. I think that has sort of widened the circle of people in the West concerned about Islamic Republic of Iran. But frankly, I do think that, to some degree, you can maybe even draw some kind of commonalities between the brevity of the sense of crisis in the West with regard to the Ukraine situation. And now, at least, and this is something I've reported quite extensively in Ukraine and followed it for many years, the story there. Now there seems to be almost, certainly a lack of sense of urgency in Western capitals about the fact that the Russians are gaining ground on a daily basis right now in Ukraine. And there is a real possibility, and I certainly hope it doesn't happen, but there's a real possibility of very significant Russian breakthroughs in various parts of that front, specifically in Kharkiv area and also in Chasiv Yar area in the central part of the front in the weeks or months ahead. So, in a certain sense, like I said, there's a commonality. I generally think there is a kind of, it's difficult to find an exact word for it, but a kind of slothfulness, if I can put it that way, in the West with regard to the notion of profound challenges to the order under which and in which we all live. I mean, I think that we should be aware that there is really a very serious, perhaps even historic, gathering challenge to the system under which we all live, which consists of the Iranian threat is the Middle Eastern piece of that, and the Russian invasion and attempt to destroy Ukraine is the European element of that. And of course, there is behind that the much more long-term systemic challenge of the People's Republic of China. That, I think, is, these, to me at least, are the key sort of moving blocks in the global system today. And I do think that there's a profound lack of awareness or slowness of awareness of the gravity of that situation in Western political systems, not only in the United States, but also in Western Europe and probably in Israel as well. Yeah, so I do think that's very noticeable. As to where that comes from, as to why it is that many of our societies don't seem to have those sort of built-in antibodies to notice a threat as it's emerging and begin to respond to it. That's perhaps a discussion beyond the scope of our talk today, because I think then we would be getting into much deeper questions of political culture and identity and what's happened to our societies in recent decades to create that atmosphere. But such an atmosphere there clearly is, and I think that's made it very, very difficult for an effective response to be brought into being. And by the way, I don't exclude Israel from this. In other words, it reminds me a little bit, the fact that after now 2 years of war, or 2 years and a bit of war in Ukraine, the Western public is Ukrained out, so to speak. People don't want to think about that anymore. In the United States Republican Party, there's this absolutely bizarre phenomenon of sort of supposed right-wing patriots who in fact are backing the Russian cause in Ukraine. This to me is bizarreness on the level of sort of Vichy France. Is something absolutely astonishing. In Israel, we don't have anything like that. But we do have a situation, and we should face this, that after 6 months of war, the Israeli public is increasingly tired of war. You can see many articles in the Israeli media today in which the authors basically relate to the war as if it was Netanyahu's war and not their war. And therefore they see no particular defeat for themselves should Netanyahu's cause be defeated in Gaza. That's all deeply worrying stuff. I'm not in any way carrying a brief for Benjamin Netanyahu, to put it mildly. I'm not, yeah. But on the other hand, usually when a country is at war, I at least would generally see it as a sign of a worrying, not absence of social cohesion, but a worrying, let's say, dip in social cohesion. If in mainstream publications, people are writing things relating to the war as if it was the prime minister's war rather than the nation's war as a whole. So yeah, I think there's a whole series of phenomena we can relate or use to explain this atmosphere, but it certainly exists.
Jonathan, could I throw one last question in, which is kind of drawing out the logic of what you've been saying? Can or should Israel pursue a forward strategy, as you put it, without US support? Is that possible? Is it an existential question of survival? So therefore, at some point, Israel has to do so, possibly without American support. That would be part one. Part two would be, is that kind of American support coming back, given some of those wider social, cultural identity issues that you pointed to? And I would add in as well the phenomena of a genuinely mass higher education system, with a higher education system that is genuinely taken over more or less completely in terms of opinion formation by a kind of anti-Israel left. I mean, by no means obvious to me.
Yeah, I think those are really good questions. First of all, can Israel act without US support? David Ben-Gurion, our first prime minister, and maybe still the greatest strategist among Israel's top executives, had it as a rule that Israel, didn't go to war unless it had at least the tacit backing of one or another great power. Iran is a large country of around 80 million people. The notion of Israel having to enter into a campaign of sort of determined rollback of Iran without clear American support is a truly daunting phenomenon. Having said that, from my own point of view, the Iranian goal of the destruction of Israel is deeply serious, goes all the way back to prior to the Islamic Revolution of 79. What I mean by that is that in the writings of those who made the revolution of 1979, the centrality of Israel and the Palestinian cause, or the desire to return Jerusalem to Islamic rule, is there. So, it goes back with the people who run Iran now. The centrality of this goes back all the way to before even they came to power. Given the seriousness of that, then yes, if it is necessary, it would seem to me that at a certain point Israel may have no choice but to align with whom it can align and to move forward. If the choice at that point is either that or simply to acquiesce to a sort of slow erosion and death by 1,000 cuts because we don't feel we've got a strong enough coalition with us, then, in a certain sense, the choice is self-explanatory. One must act to defend one's existence if such a choice is imposed upon us. I sincerely hope it won't be. I sincerely hope that we will find some way of ensuring American and Western support. But yeah, in a certain sense, once again, for that, it's a little bit beyond the scope of our conversation. I agree very much with the way you put it, that the capture of the sort of intellectual high ground by Israel's enemies, and I think also by the West's enemies to a great extent, is a deeply worrying phenomenon. What it means in practice is that there is a kind of fifth column inside Western societies at a time when Western societies are, in my estimation, as I mentioned earlier, entering a moment of very great peril, of very great challenge from without. And that's an additional very, very worrying phenomenon. What can I tell you? I hope for the best. In the past, Western societies have been through moments of great doubt and uncertainty and weakness, and have found within themselves finally, sometimes at the last, in the last moment, have found within themselves finally the capacity to understand the stakes and then to organize appropriately. We're not yet at that point with regard to Western societies, and it worries me. I hope we will reach that point. I suspect that if we do, it will come about as a result of a growing realization that the challenges that Israel faces and the challenges that Western countries face are in essence of a piece, and that therefore supporting Israel is not a sort of act of luxury or altruism on the part of Western elites, but it is rather simply an act of self-interest. And by the way, let me add that the same logic, in my view, applies to supporting Ukraine and Ukraine's fight for survival. I think the same logic applies in both cases.
Jonathan, on that note of cautious hope, will end, I think, in a very illuminating and, I suspect for many viewers, a necessarily sobering conversation. For all of it, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Jack. Thanks, Alan.